Hello and welcome to Africa Today. I am Esther Makwariola. It is the fourth day of 2019 in what is now the end of a timeline and the beginning of another. With colors of celebration fast fading into shades of expectations, early days are still creating the need to reflect on events that shaped 2018 and may eventually define how the next 12 months would turn out to be. Well, this special episode features Africa in Retrospect 2018 with key focus on events between October, November and December. We take a report and Africa Today will continue. Welcome on board.
Of the Reserve Bank.
On Thursday, October the 11th, South African Finance Minister Nlala Nene resigned. The resignation follows a string of allegations connecting Nene with the Guptas, a wealthy South African family that repeatedly finds itself in the purview of political scandals. The controversy emerges at a time when Cyril Ramaphosa, the current president of South Africa, had made it a pledge of his campaign to restore public trust, confidence and stability in the government after Jacob Zuma's presidency. Monday, October the 22nd, Cameroon announced official results following presidential elections held on October the 7th, 2018. Incumbent President Paul Biya won the election with 71% of the vote. This is the seventh time in office and will allow him to govern until 2025. Thursday, October the 25th, Ethiopia appointed its first female president, Saleh Work Zwede. Her appointment comes after President Mulatu Teshome resigned from his post a year before the end of his term. The appointment of Ethiopia's first female president follows Prime Minister Abiy's announcement of a gender-balanced cabinet. Ethiopia is the third country in Africa after Rwanda and Seychelles to achieve such. Wednesday, October the 31st, South Sudan hosted a ceremony to mark the implementation of a new peace agreement between President Salva Kiir and opposition leader Riek Machar. The ceremony held in Juba, the country's capital, saw Riek Machar return to the country for the first time since 2016. Monday, November the 5th, gunmen abducted 78 students from their boarding school outside of Bamenda, an Anglophone city in northwest Cameroon. Though most of the students were reunited with their parents later in the week, the school principal, a teacher, and two students who have parents in high-ranking government offices remained in the custody of the kidnappers. While separatists in the north were blamed, no group laid claim to the kidnappings. Tuesday, December the 4th, Sudanese lawmakers backed a constitutional amendment to extend presidential term limits. President Omar al-Bashir, who has been in power since 1989, is currently expected to step down in 2020 when his term ends. Tuesday, December the 4th, the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, continued to spread through North Kivu province, reaching the city of Butembo and several isolated areas. According to the World Health Organization, the outbreak is now the second worst in history, behind the outbreak in West Africa, which killed more than 11,000 people between 2014 and 2016. Friday, December the 7th, Zambia's High Court ruled that President Edgar Lungu may run in the 2021 elections, finding that by doing so, he would not be breaching the two-term constitutional limit. Lungu's first term lasted only 1 year and 6 months. Thursday, December the 13th, 10 days ahead of a presidential election in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a fire destroyed an election commission warehouse in the capital city, Kinshasa. The warehouse contained thousands of new voting machines, which have been a source of controversy as elections approach.
Welcome back. Now joining me to look at the review of some of the top stories that made headlines in Africa, I have Daniel Akinlami, political analyst and social commentator. Good to have you here on the program.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Now let's take a look at the elections which held in Central Africa. Talking about Cameroon here now. Paul Biya was re-elected as a seventh time for the country as a seventh-time president, amidst reports of low voter turnout and, of course, intimidation. Now, well, thousands were unable to vote because of insecurity at the time, owing to the unrest in the country's English-speaking provinces and the attacks by separatist rebels, which left, well, hundreds dead. Now, what are your thoughts on the events that unfolded during that period and how it affected the Central African region?
Well, I think the Cameroon last election is not in any way different from what we've witnessed in Africa in the past 3 decades. We've seen such repeated in Zimbabwe by Robert Mugabe before he was eventually pushed out of government.
Right.
And if we look at this trend, these individuals perhaps started by being the liberator through a military coup, then transformed to become a civilian president. So over the time, they've captured the system, captured the electoral institution. So when they come out and they amend the constitution of their country that give them the leeway to continue to contest forever, it becomes very difficult to stop them. And in addition to the fact that in many of these countries, the opposition parties are not strong, not well funded, and also not united. So it wasn't really strange to see Paul Biya coming back, even on the sick bed, contesting for another 7th time and winning the election. But I think what is actually disturbing in Africa is the fact that this trend continue to go on for years without being challenged.
Now, why is this the problem? Because if we keep having presidents who keep, sitting tight without leaving out when the time is up for them, what is the problem? Is it our institutions that are weak, or what exactly is the problem?
Well, I think the problem is even far more complex than the institutions that are weak. These are individuals that have captured the state's power, and with all the attending authority with it. There are many of them that are larger than life. They are like a civilian dictator. Now, a president that has been in power for 6 consecutive times. Now, for any opposition group to dislodge such a president, the opposition need as much work as possible to gather themselves to be united. Now, what we see in most of this election is the opposition that is fragmented, trying to come against a sit-tight president. And beyond that, there's also a limit to what African Union can do. These countries have sovereignty. They have the exclusive power to determine their affairs. So it will take an internal rebellion to dislodge as many of them as possible. Because going through the democratic way, if the opposition cannot unite to work together and really plan very well ahead before the poll time, it will still be difficult to remove them. You can see this in most of the post-dictators in East Africa and Central Africa, even in DRC, that led them into long years of war. So when somebody comes into power, and this is still happening in Africa because we have not learned how we can have a democratic practice where everybody will participate and where leaders will leave the stage when the ovation is loud. Instead of having leaders that will convert the state apparatus to family affair and want to perpetuate themselves and then put their children to replace them when they are even gone. So the work to do in Africa is beyond building the institutions. The institutions are actually weak.
Right.
The electoral institutions, commissions cannot stand this sit-tight president. They dictate to what happened to the chairman of those electoral commission. They even appoint the people that will sit there to do their bidding. But the people need to rise.
Right.
We need to challenge them. The people need to stand up.
Okay.
They will suffer. They will be crushed. They will be suppressed. But when they stand, they can pull all these regimes down.
Okay, let's quickly look at another development in African politics, which is quite remarkable, where Ethiopia appointed its first female president, Sahle-Work Zewde. Well, her appointed follows Prime Minister Abiy's announcement of a gender-balanced cabinet. Now, how would you assess female representation in African politics, and what would it take for other countries, on the continent to embrace gender-balanced cabinet as seen in countries like Rwanda and, of course, Seychelles?
Well, I think there's a great hope ahead.
Right.
Yeah, and in the past 6 to 10 years now, we've been seeing great reports from countries like Rwanda. They've really done so well in pushing for this. And I think if the rest of Africa can follow suit, we can have a better women representation in the parliament, in the executive, and in every aspect of leadership.
But what will it take, because it's usually a talk issue, because most countries, they know these things happen in other African countries and, of course, outside African continent, for instance. But where you have countries that are yet to embrace the woman as a contributor to national development, is it more of ethical or ethnical belief, or traditional belief, more or less, if I will put it that way, that a woman should be at home, or she shouldn't be seen at the forefront? So giving her that choice, or giving her that right to come in governance as a first lady, or as a female president rather, is going to be a tall order.
Yeah, it is a tall order. What happened in Ethiopia is commendable. It's outstanding. But we can't rule out the fact that there is barrier and the ceiling that's been put and placed upon women participation in politics in many countries in Africa.
Right.
And it will take great effort, especially for women in some of those countries, even in Nigeria. It will take great effort for them not to succumb, not to give up. You know what they say? Power is not served a la carte. You have to keep pushing for it. You have to fight for it. But look at countries like Nigeria, Ghana, and even Kenya. Strategically, this kind of leadership that's going on in those 3 countries, even Kenya, you see men are fighting men. Like real life war and battle over power.
Absolutely.
So you can imagine how soon will the women be able to get in to the center stage to wrestle power with these people. But notwithstanding how difficult it is, how tough, the physical challenge attached to it, the emotional challenge, and even the spiritual challenge. So irrespective of this, women generally in Africa should brace up and rise up to this challenge. They should not give up.
All right, let's quickly hold your thought. We need to go on a very quick break. Now you're watching Africa Today. We've been looking at Africa in Retrospect 2018 ahead of the expectations in the new year. Welcome back. Well, I still have my guest in the studio with me, Daniel Akinlami, and we are x-raying the events that happened in Africa in 2018 and, of course, giving our projections for 2019. Now, let's look at, aside from female representation in African politics, now let's look at South Sudan. South Sudan, we know, in last December, hosted a ceremony to mark the implementation of a new deal between President Salva Kiir, or last October, that is, between President Salva Kiir and the opposition leader Riek Machar, and the ceremony saw Machar return to the country for the first time since 2016. Now, what do you make of the efforts now to reunite the warring parties in South Sudan that has plunged the country into more than 4 years of civil war, chased millions from their homes, and of course caused millions of deaths? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the first important thing is the fact that we need to see the two parties following the details of the agreement that brought this peace deal. If either of them fail to follow the agreement, we're going to find ourselves back to where we were before. They've made about 3 or 4 attempts to be reunited in the last 6 years. They've all failed. It came like this in 2016. So the same agreement they reached then also failed. So what is important at this point is if both of them are sincere to follow the rudiment of this agreement and allow peace to reign so that South Sudan can begin to progress. If the incumbent president is willing and ready this time around to concede, because the issue has always been about conceding, some part of his power for Riek Machar so that they can cohabit, and then there can now be a transition process.
Right.
So, and that transition process has been proposed for the past 10 years. We've never got there. So we just hope this time around the transition can happen and there can be a proper election and the people of South Sudan can actually know true peace.
And in talking about transition, where do you think the country will be in 2019? Because everyone has said this is not the first time the country has, called for a peace deal and it ended up being broken afterwards. What are your projections for the country in 2019?
Well, I think if they follow the agreement and the deal and they are committed to it, that's the most important part of this. If both parties are committed and this time around they want peace to reign, I think South Sudan will make progress in 2019. And we can actually see good life returning, the economy becoming more viable.
Right.
But anything contrary, if either of them try to upstage the deal and try to take the other camp by surprise again, then I think what may await the country may be more than what we've seen in the past few years. Because this is the golden opportunity to put the past behind.
Right.
So that the people can have a new life, the country can be revived.
And do you suppose perhaps it will be better for the country to go back to where it's coming from in terms of Sudan now? Because, it seceded from Sudan in the first place to be independent. So do you think perhaps that would be another option?
Well, I think that's going to be the most difficult thing. Because events have overtaken their desire for independence. They've got independence. But they had to learn certain ways how they could form a country and run the country. Very sad indeed that South Sudan ended up this way. It started as a very promising country.
Right.
But apart from all that we've seen in the past 10 years, there is still a bright future ahead of them. If they can pick the lessons from this crisis and the leaders can now become selfless, if they can put the country above their interests and then begin to rebuild, the country can bounce back.
All right. Let's be hopeful that in that regard. But let's look at Sudan now. Last December, the Sudanese leaders, lawmakers rather, backed a constitutional amendment to extend the presidential term limits of Omar al-Bashir, who has been in power since 1989. Well, it brings us back to what we discussed earlier in the start of the show, where we talked about Cameroon's Paul Biya, who got 7th time as the country's president, and all that followed afterwards. But the issue of sit-tight leaders is always a bone of contention in African leadership. Why do you think this is almost impossible to nip in the bud, which seems to be like a usual occurrence?
Well, it should be impossible because these are sovereign nations. And I think there's a little that African Union can do. Well,
you've pointed out that in your earlier
suggestions. Where we have now,
right?
It didn't start with Sudan.
Okay.
Don't forget, in the past 3-4 years, we had Uganda, DRC, and some other countries, about 5 of them, within the space of 2 to 3 years. extended the tenure
Right.
of their president. So it's now becoming, and it's continuing to happen because the countries that have gone that way, there has not been a way or policy or a diplomatic approach from Africa and beyond to put them in check, either by sanctions or by the international community coming to reinforce the ideal situation in a democratic setting.
But do you
now,
think
it's possible
all right,
for most of these leaders to push for this extension because they control the legislative arm. Oftentimes, they cornered and taken over the whole structure of the country. So their stooge in the parliament always rubber stamp some of these motions. So having the resurgence and the rebellion within the country that can stop this may be very difficult. But if we get to that point where the international community can begin to weigh in on some of these things, where the people have the choice to determine the kind of government they desire,
Right, that's
the
talking
kind of
about
leadership they want,
Yeah.
especially in democracy.
Right.
Either it's going to be 2-term presidential, or it's going to be infinite term, or it's going to be 3-term. But the abuse of this 3-4 times infinite time is what is worrisome. So if African Union can begin to look at the way, because this is part of the things that's been embarrassing the progress that Africa should have.
All right. Now let's look at the issue of Congo elections now, politics in Congo, where, it was expected that Emmanuel Shadri might become the successor of, Joseph Kabila. But right now the elections were stalled, and of course we had reports where the electoral the papers, for the elections were all destroyed in fire. Now, what's your assessment of how elections are being held in Africa and how the opposition and the government of the day are able to accept that people need to make a choice in choosing who leads them than to wait for a rubber stamp?
Well, like in the case of this DRC now, I think the only progress we've made is as a result of individuals who personally believed that their ambition is not worth the life of any citizen of their country. Will walk away from power, either defeated at election and handed over. But we have a group of people in Africa that are hell-bent in returning to power at all costs, even if they have to truncate democratic process, if they have to destroy democratic institutions. And this is still prevalent in many countries in Africa. Like the DRC we're talking about. Election is meant to be seamless. Election is meant to be naturally peaceful. The electoral body will provide all the process and the avenue, and you go there and cast the vote. But it doesn't. We don't make it to happen like that in Africa because of the vested interest. Now, many of these leaders have seen the position where they are as a place where they cannot forget. And that's where it starts from. The greed in our leaders in Africa, the selfishness. If the people put their country above their ambition, they will not intervene in what the Electoral Commission is doing.
Okay, finally, in a nutshell, what are your projections for 2019 as it regards African leadership and the style of governance?
Well, I think 2019 is going to throw up usual challenge. There are going to be elections in some countries like Nigeria. And there are countries too that are looking forward to having peace return as well.
Right.
So I think what we should look forward to is to see leaders who can now rise above the challenges. We should look forward to see leaders who can put their country above their ambition.
Right.
And this is also instructive to the election that's coming up in Nigeria. I think we should be looking forward to see Nigeria that will lead and be a good example for Africa.
Right.
And all the stakeholders involved in the Nigeria election, we wish they can look at the antecedents, especially the last two elections. Even the last election in 2015, someone was defeated and accepted defeat and brought peace to the country. So whoever is going to be the winner or loser in elections that are coming up, even in Nigeria,
Right.
they should consider the fact that the country is far more important than their individual ambition.
All right, and on that positive note, I'd like to thank you, Daniel Akinlami, political analyst and social commentator, for your analysis on the show tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Well, the last 12 months was both eventful one and mixed bag for Africa, with situations that left the continent stuck between the threat of a tipping point and the need for a paradigm shift. Well, 2018 may not have gone as planned for millions of people, but in the midst of the doom and gloom are events that can inspire the living and remain thankful and keep hope alive in the new year. And that is our package for tonight. But don't forget to join the conversation as usual on Twitter at TVC News NG and follow me for updates around Africa at Esther TVC News. Until the next one again, I am Esther Mokwariola, and always remember, Africa can only get better.